opportunity to talk this afternoon. And so I'd like to present a somewhat philosophical perspective on some of the work we do in human genetics, and it's actually quite related to some things that have happened recently. That's why I changed the title of my presentation at the last minute. So to give a bit of a context, I've been working a lot on mass surveillance, in particular the deployment of DNA databases in China, in particular in Xinjiang. So currently in Xinjiang, there is active persecution of Muslim ethnic groups, particularly the Uyghur, the Kazakh, the Kyrgyz, and some others, with mass internment, disappearances, forced birth control, amounting basically to crimes against humanity. Something that characterizes this persecution is the intensive use of technology. We're talking about all surveillance modalities that are currently available, cameras with facial recognition, tracking of GPS signals, monitoring through police officers of information that gets directly integrated in a central surveillance database. So this goes beyond just surveillance. I would call that an authoritarian or totalitarian control society that is being implemented there. And one of the modalities of surveillance control has been a large program of DNA collection for the setup of a forensic DNA database that potentially can cover the whole population. How many exactly have been profiled into the database, it is not known. What we know is that the resources that were put forward were enough to cover the entire population, that directives were given to do exactly that. Whether this was fully carried out is not entirely clear. We're talking about collecting DNA profiles from all residents aged 12 to 65, and also in some cases even school children. And so we should not limit our perspective to just DNA, because actually it is this multiplicity of modalities of surveillance that creates this intense form of control of individuals. But I don't want to focus too much on this part at the moment. Just plug in my next talk later in the day. You can come if you want to know more about that. But one of the key aspects that emerged in studying the deployment of this technology was actually the role of scientific research in actually preparing all the bits and pieces that are necessary for rolling out that technology. We're talking about, indeed, forensic population genetics, or by that I mean population genetic studies using exactly the techniques that are used by law enforcement, both to do population genetic studies, understand the origin of populations, but also to calibrate kits, forensic DNA profiling kits, for direct relevance in law enforcement. And law enforcement is maybe not the right word, because actually we have no evidence that this is actually fully focused on trying to solve crimes. It seems more a kind of surveillance fetish where authorities want to collect all possible information about everyone, creating intense fear within individuals that whatever they do, whatever they think, whoever they are, is within the control and the reach of the state. So the role of academics in doing research in forensic population genetics has been very strong, and that was really questionable, really worrying. Even more worrying, actually, in that field of research, so population genetic studies using the tools of forensic genetics directly relevant for law enforcement on different ethnic groups in China, including the Han majority, that actually those publications, 1,000 to 1,200 of them, about half of them have a co-author linked with the police forces of the judicial forces. So this is actually never seen elsewhere, that really the enmeshment between academic researchers and police and judiciary is immensely tight. So this is actually a plot of co-authorship between institutions, so how a ball gives how many publications fall under a certain institution, and the thickness of the line shows how often basically two institutions co-publish together. Basically, you cannot be a major player in that area in China without having to collaborate closely with the police. Now, part of that will serve to actually create this DNA database as part of a surveillance program, but a big chunk is also about population genetics, trying to understand the diversity of the populations in China or elsewhere in the world, because that kind of work is carried out by many researchers across the world. And of course, mapping the genetic history of populations is a fascinating question and something that, as a scientist, I also have a keen interest on. What is the history of certain populations? How did they come to be? Where do they come from? More generally, we're interested in biological diversity, so this is even a broader topic. Essentially, we'd like to map, indeed, these groups across the world as part of the family of life across the Earth. However, we have to ask ourselves, what are the implications of doing this kind of research? And so one issue actually surfaced that I thought was actually very disturbing, in fact. That is, when I came across research on high-altitude adaptation of Tibetan populations. And that's where I'd like to focus the direction of the talk from now. Basically, this is truly fascinating from a biological perspective. So when you and I, most of us, would move and go and live permanently above 2,000, 3,000 meters, this would be a serious strain on our bodies. Long-term adaptation is actually difficult for many of us. And Tibet is an integral part of the Chinese territory currently, and it's actually a massive part of China. I actually never realized that. It's actually about a quarter of the surface of China is the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, so not just the Tibet province, but broader. It's actually not a very easy place to be, so in a certain sense you could say, well, it's basically a high-altitude desert. I mean, it's immensely beautiful, obviously, but why would you worry about what's really happening there? I mean, is this just a question of understanding the biology of how our bodies can adapt genetically to high altitude? The problem is that a lot of the research done on this topic does involve Chinese military forces. And actually, it is, from a geostrategic perspective, a very important place for Chinese authorities, Tibet, and they certainly do not want to lose control of it. Personally, I have a hard time imagining war in the Tibet region because it's actually such a difficult place, but there is really actually conflicts between, for example, India and China about some regions, about the size of Belgium, my own country. That is a disputed area between China and India, so there are tensions there. And so, for example, the Chinese military wants to send soldiers and station them at high altitude in Tibet or be able to combat there. Now, of course, when you ask the question, well, what is the genetic basis for actually functioning at high altitude, and you start thinking in those terms, that is actually certainly a very different question. Actually, people who go and live there and are not native of those areas, they do suffer of a complex syndrome of chronic mountain sickness, in particular something called high-altitude polycythemia, that has a really number of severe symptoms, going from cognitive difficulties to cardiovascular problems like low birth weight of children born to a mother who are not adapted to these regions. And so understanding that scientifically is very interesting. However, when you go across the literature, you sometimes come across things that are really quite disturbing. So, for example, here is a statement of a scientist working in this study stating that, yes, if we understand and unravel the genetic basis of that adaptation, we will be able to screen the people that we send to that area. Of course, that eases the control of an area that has actually been rather restive for a long time or in the past decades. If you can actually send people and not having to send them back home because they get very sick just by genetic screening. So when we say we want to get fundamental science and understand the fundamental basis, biological basis of some important phenomena, fascinating phenomena, sometimes there is no way around the fact that even very fundamental knowledge can be political. And so now we are actually accumulating all that data. We're bringing all that data together very rapidly. And we're creating maps of human genetic diversity. So this is from SNP data, actually a principal and component analysis of some SNP data of European populations. And we actually see that in the data, we can find back actually the geographical structure of European populations. So yes, there are genetic differences between populations. What they mean is another question, but they do exist. Pretending that there is no map of genetic diversity across the world, it would be incorrect. So that brings me to the philosophical part of what maps are. So maybe we could compare the time we are about, this is a map from Abraham Ortelius, one of the first world maps. This is actually from Leuven, my area, Leuven in Antwerp, where they were publishing the first maps on a large scale in the 17th century, Mercator and all this kind of work. And of course, these maps are not too great yet, but they kind of already catch most of the story. So in the past, when you talked about countries, entities that we need to distinguish from each other, well, where do borders come from? How do we put borders between countries? Well, if you go back in history, so this is the example of France, well, the border with Spain is the Pyrenees mountains, the border with Italy is the Alps. I particularly love the border between Germany and France, which is the Rhine River. So these geographic milestones, because of their physical nature, do mark clear distinctions between geographical areas and therefore influence the populations living there. Now, for human genetics, it's actually quite a different story. We don't have those very nice borders. I mean, this is a map of lactose tolerance, where mutations that allow processing of lactose and so better survival across the world emerge at several places at slightly different times and then diffused sometimes quite rapidly. This is lactose tolerance. This is another mutation on alcohol dehydrogenase and how you're able to process alcohol, because humans and apes had to be able to eat rotten fruit, which ferments and actually does contain up to 8% alcohol. I discovered that when making this slide. So you don't want to be drunk when you have to run away from a leopard or whatever dangerous animal might have been living in that area. So these strong geographic boundaries are kind of rare, or physiological genetic boundaries. Tibet is one quite special example. I don't think you will be able to find many of those. However, when you create maps, you make something possible that was not possible before. Before, the borders had often to be related to, for example, geographic structures, mountains, rivers. When you have good maps, you can actually start drawing borders on the map and decide to separate people based on lines that, from authority, you put on the maps. And so this is a map of the US, and of course some of those boundaries clearly have just been drawn with a slider on the map. And when you can do that, you can start doing really weird things. So this is actually a map of a Belgian town, Baarle-Hertog. That town is kind of special because it's a Belgian town inside the Netherlands. And actually, inside Baarle-Hertog, that is inside the Netherlands, there is actually Dutch exclaves, the size sometimes smaller than a soccer field, that are Dutch territory. So the inner places, that's Dutch territory, inside the Belgian territory, inside the Dutch territory, going back to disputes in the Middle Ages. That is actually how the border is marked across town. That's how the border gets marked across town. I mean, I'm not making this up, this is real. You can take your car and go and visit. So human beings, once they have map, they actually will draw boundaries. And the reason I'm bringing that story to you today is that actually, I'll come back to in a second, but the history of that is actually quite nasty, of this drawing boundaries. So I come from Belgium. Actually, Rwanda, Urundi was a Belgian colony in the beginning of the 20th century. And we sent our scientists, anthropometrists, to Rwanda, Urundi to actually distinguish between the existing populations of Hutu, Tutsis, and Twas. And there are pictures and movies of that. So this is not, this is actual pictures of how these scientists were working. And that led to Belgian authorities, for a very political reason, for controlling Rwanda, Urundi, while they were actually focusing on Congo that had more natural resources. They decided that the society would have to be controlled by the Tutsis, which were less numerous, that they actually tended to be richer, because that was one of the factors that could make you labeled as a Tutsi. If you had, I think, 10 cows, if I remember correctly, then you would be labeled a Tutsi. And then you got these papers that never existed before, but they were issued by the Belgian authorities, and these played an important role in the Rwandan genocide, because then people were assigned, a line was drawn between people and decided through the authorities, the government, you belong there, you belong there. So maps are a serious object, and we need to be very careful about them. And the reason I'm bringing that story today, although this has been a story that I had in my drawers for a long time, is actually recently there is this article from 2010 that came back in the news in Belgium. And this is a kind of a fringe research paper, but by a researcher that now was affiliated with a Belgian university, claiming that on a phylogenetic level, you could actually split the human race into two separate species, okay? And the bad thing, and the thing that surprised everyone, is that that ended up in the document that was put out by the Buffalo massacre shooter, okay? So these ideas, they are actually, there is a demand for them. So when you put these ideas out, you cannot claim that this is just like some kind of research. I mean, the research is very questionable. How the research functions and its links are also very questionable. But so creating maps is dangerous. I'm not saying we should not build them, but I'm saying we should think very hard about them. We have to accept that if we want to do this kind of research, part of the cost of doing business, and we will have to fight that Hydra, this is Hercules fighting the Hydra monster as part of his 12 labors, we'll have to keep fighting that Hydra and cutting its heads over and over again. We thought that we were done with scientific racism, but we are not. It's going to come back, and we have to fight every day. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.